The morning Alice Kendrick asked Seth Graves to carry her late husband's Bible was the morning everything in both their lives changed forever, though neither of them had the sense to know it yet. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878 was not a place that welcomed softness. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a burr caught in a horse's mane, rough and unshakable, full of drovers and gamblers and men who had left something behind them in states they no longer named. The wind came off the plains in long, cold sheets, carrying red dust and the smell of cattle, and the streets ran with mud when it rained and cracked into pale ceramic patterns when it dried. It was a town that chewed people up and sorted them, and the ones who stayed were the ones who had learned to chew back. Seth Graves had lived in Caldwell for 3 years without making a single friend, and he had done it deliberately. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches in his boots, broad across the shoulders in a way that made doorframes feel like a personal insult, with dark hair that curled at his collar and gray eyes the color of November sky right before a hard freeze. He had a jaw that could have been carved with an axe and hands so scarred and calloused that they looked like they belonged on a man twice his age, though Seth was only 31. He worked the cattle yards when the drives came through. He broke horses for the livery when the work dried up, and he drank alone at the far end of the bar at the Longhorn Saloon on the nights when the loneliness got too loud to ignore. Men gave him a wide berth, not because Seth Graves was cruel, exactly, though he had put 3 men on the ground in his time in Caldwell without breaking a sweat. They gave him space because there was something in his eyes that suggested a man who had already calculated the cost of everything and had already decided it was not worth paying. He was not mean. He was simply done. Done with noise, done with trouble, done with the particular kind of hope that got a man killed or broken. The people of Caldwell called him the roughest man in the territory, and he had never once corrected them, because the correction would have required more conversation than he was willing to have. Alice Kendrick had been in Caldwell for 6 weeks when their story truly began, though she had been in Kansas for 2 years before that, living out on the Kendrick homestead 20 miles east of town with her husband Thomas and their 7-year-old daughter Clara. Thomas Kendrick had been a good man, a gentle man, a farmer who read poetry aloud to his wife in the evenings and taught Clara to identify every constellation visible from the plains. He had come west from Ohio with plans and hope and enough seed money to make something real, and he had made something real for 3 years before a fever took him in July, quick and without mercy, the way the plains took things it wanted. Alice was 27. She was not fragile, and she did not think of herself that way. She had dark auburn hair she wore pinned back, green eyes that caught light like creek water in summer, and a manner that was quiet but not timid, the kind of quiet that came from a woman who thought carefully before she spoke because she intended to be understood the first time. She had buried Thomas herself, with the help of a neighboring farmer named Old Hector Prout, and she had kept the homestead going through the rest of July and all of August, trying to make the numbers work, trying to find a way to hold the land that Thomas had loved. The numbers did not work. Thomas had borrowed against the land to buy seed after a poor spring, and with him gone, the bank in Caldwell had come calling with a politeness that was worse than cruelty, because it made the whole business seem reasonable. She had 30 days to vacate, and she had used every one of them to grieve and to plan and to find somewhere to go. What she found was a small room above the dry goods store run by a woman named Margaret Holt, who had lost her own husband to a cattle drive gone wrong 4 years prior, and who had built herself back up into the most organized merchant in Caldwell. Margaret had offered Alice work stocking shelves and keeping ledgers, and Alice had accepted, because Clara needed food and warmth, and Alice Kendrick was not a woman who sat down and waited to be rescued. She arrived in Caldwell on a Wednesday in September with a wagon borrowed from Hector Prout and everything she owned in the world loaded into it. A bed frame and a mattress rolled and roped, a cedar chest that had been her mother's, 2 trunks of clothing and linens. a cast iron stove that Thomas had been so proud of, a rocking chair, a small wooden crate of books, a milk crate of kitchen things wrapped in dish towels. And in her hands, carried separately, wrapped in a piece of wool flannel she had cut from one of Thomas's shirts, his Bible. His name was written in it in his own hand, and hers, and Clara's birth date, and it was the one thing she would not trust to the back of a wagon. Seth Graves was not having a remarkable morning. He had finished a job at the livery at sunup, collecting $2 for 3 days of breaking a particularly obstinate roan that had finally surrendered to reason. He was walking back through town, hat pulled low, intending to buy coffee and bread at the general store, intending to speak to no one, when the borrowed wagon from Hector Prout came rolling down Main Street, and the woman driving it pulled it to a stop directly in front of the dry goods store. He would have kept walking. He genuinely would have. He was a man who had made an art form out of keeping walking. But the little girl on the wagon seat, 7 years old with her mother's green eyes and a serious face that was currently surveying the town of Caldwell with the expression of a general assessing hostile territory, looked directly at Seth Graves as he passed and said, without any preamble at all, "Mister, you are very large." Seth stopped. He did not know why. He looked at the child, who looked back at him with complete composure, and something in him that had been cold and still for a very long time shifted, just barely, like a sheet of river ice when the temperature first begins to turn. "I have been told that before," he said. "Clara," said the woman climbing down from the wagon. Her voice was warm and tired, and it had a note in it that he would come to recognize later as the specific exhaustion of a person who has been strong for too long and has not yet found a place to put it down. "That is not how we greet people." "I was stating a fact," Clara said reasonably. Alice Kendrick turned and looked at Seth Graves. He noticed that she was pretty in a way that was not delicate, the kind of pretty that came from good bones and sharp intelligence, and a woman who was too busy living to spend much time thinking about it. He noticed that she was holding something wrapped in flannel against her chest, as though it was the most important thing in the world. "I am sorry about her," Alice said. "She has her father's habit of saying whatever is true without checking whether it is welcome." "It was not unwelcome," Seth said, which was more words at once than he typically spent on strangers, and he was already slightly irritated with himself for it. Alice glanced at the back of the wagon. She glanced at the door of the dry goods store, which was up 3 steps from the street. She glanced at the time it was going to take her to unload everything herself while keeping an eye on Clara, and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the quiet arithmetic of a woman who had been doing everything alone for months. She looked back at him. Not with desperation, not with pleading, just with a frankness that he found unexpectedly disarming. "I know you don't know me," she said, "but would you be willing to carry something, just the one thing, this?" She held out the wrapped Bible. "I need both hands to manage the tailgate and I cannot put this down on the ground." Seth looked at the flannel-wrapped object. He looked at Alice Kendrick. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with the same serious assessment she had been directing at the town a moment earlier. He took the Bible. He felt, through the wool flannel, the hard corners of it, the particular weight of a book well used. And then, because he was Seth Graves and something inside him had just made a decision that his conscious mind had not entirely agreed to yet, he set the Bible carefully down on the seat of the wagon and turned and pulled back the tailgate himself. Alice stared at him. "I will carry everything," he said, because it needed saying and because there was no other logical response to the situation, and because Seth Graves, underneath all the layers of careful distance and deliberate solitude, was a man who could not in good conscience watch a widow unload a wagon alone. "That is not necessary," she said. "I only asked for—" "I know what you asked for," he said, not unkindly. "This will be faster." He picked up the cast iron stove as though it were a sack of grain. Alice Kendrick watched him walk up the 3 steps with it and through the door of the dry goods store, and her mouth opened slightly, and Clara, sitting on the wagon seat, said quietly and with great satisfaction, "I knew he was very large for a reason." It took Seth 45 minutes to unload the entire wagon. He carried the bed frame in 2 trips, the rolled mattress on his shoulder, the cedar chest with the careful steadiness of a man who understood that certain things were not just things, the trunks, the rocking chair, the crate of books which he noticed had Dickens and Tennyson and a worn copy of A Natural History of North American Plants. He carried the Bible last, handing it directly back to Alice with 2 hands, the way you handed over something that mattered. She took it and held it to her chest again and looked at him for a moment that stretched in a way that made him want to leave immediately. "Thank you," she said. "Truly, what do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "That is not right. A man's labor." "Nothing," he said again, and he put his hat back on, which was as close to a goodbye as he typically got, and he turned and walked away before she could argue, because he suspected that Alice Kendrick was very good at arguing, and he did not want to find out he was right. He walked the rest of the way to the general store and bought his coffee and his bread, and sat on the step outside and drank the coffee and ate the bread and told himself that was the end of it. He had done a decent thing. He was capable of decent things. It did not have to mean anything further. He believed this for approximately 3 days. On Thursday morning, he walked past the dry goods store and heard the sound of something heavy scraping against the floor above, and he stopped, and he looked up at the second-story window, and he told himself to keep walking, and instead he went inside and found Margaret Holt at the counter and asked, without looking directly at her, whether the woman upstairs needed anything moved. Margaret Holt was 54 years old, had seen everything worth seeing in Caldwell and a great deal that wasn't, and had the poker face of a woman who knew better than to smile at exactly the wrong moment. She said, quite neutrally, that she believed the bed frame might need to be shifted, and she went upstairs and came back down and said yes, the bed frame needed shifting, and could he manage? He managed. He shifted the bed frame while Alice directed him with a focused precision that he found he did not mind. The way she saw the space, and knew exactly what she wanted, and said so directly without apology or excessive decoration. Clara sat in the rocking chair in the corner doing arithmetic in a primer and watching Seth, the way a naturalist might watch a species it had previously believed to be solitary. When the bed frame was where Alice wanted it, she made him coffee. He drank it standing up because there was only one chair and it was under Clara, and the second chair was still in pieces from the move. She stood on the other side of the small stove and drank hers, and they talked for the first time in a way that was more than the practical exchange of words. She told him about Thomas, not in the way of grief performances, but plainly, the way you describe a good man to someone who had not known him and ought to. She told him Thomas had been a farmer and a reader and had had a good laugh, the kind that surprised you by being louder than you expected. She told him Thomas had been dead for 2 months and she was still not used to the quiet. Seth did not tell her about himself. He listened, which he was better at than most people realized, and he drank his coffee and looked out the window at the flat Kansas sky and thought about quiet, because he had been cultivating quiet for 3 years and she was describing it as a wound. When he left that second time, he told himself again that it was over. He had helped. It was a human thing. He could return to his ordinary distance without guilt. He came back the following Monday with a bundle of firewood, because October in Caldwell was cold, and the wood stacked behind the dry goods store was green and would smoke, and not burn properly, and he had half a cord of good split oak behind the livery that he'd cut in August and had more of than he needed. He left it stacked by the back door without knocking. Alice came into the dry goods store the next morning while he was buying tobacco and looked at him across the counter and said, "That was you." "The firewood." He focused on the tobacco. "The wood at the back of this building is green. It will not burn properly and it will fill your chimney with creosote." "Seth Graves," Margaret Holt said from behind the counter, and there was a quality in her voice like a woman who was having a very satisfying morning. "Did you cut and stack a cord of oak for the widow Kendrick?" "Half cord," he said. "He did," Alice said, and when Seth finally looked at her, she was smiling, and the smile was not grateful exactly, or rather it was grateful, but it was also something else, something more complicated and more interested, and Seth found that he needed to look back at the tobacco rather urgently. "You did not need to do that," Alice said. "I was aware of that," he said. She bought coffee and flour and went back upstairs, and Seth Graves stood at the counter for a moment longer than necessary, and Margaret Holt did not say a single word, and he was grateful to her for that. October deepened into its cold self, and Seth found reasons to be near the dry goods store with a frequency that he would not have admitted was deliberate. He repaired a step that had gone loose. He found that the sign above the door had a nail working itself free and fixed that too. He came by on a Saturday afternoon and found Clara sitting on the front step doing nothing at all, which was unusual enough for Clara that he stopped. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Waiting," Clara said. "What?" She looked at him with those green eyes. "I don't know yet," she said. "That is what makes it interesting." He sat down on the step beside her, which surprised him, and they waited together for 10 minutes, during which time nothing happened, and it was surprisingly comfortable. "Do you know what that bird is?" Clara asked, pointing at a small brown bird on the fence across the street. He looked. "Song sparrow," he said. "You can tell by the streaks on the breast and the dark spot in the center." Clara studied it very seriously, and then wrote something in a little notebook she produced from her coat pocket. Seth looked at the notebook and saw that it was a list of birds with small, careful drawings next to each name. Several of the drawings were quite good. "Your father teach you that?" he asked. "He started it," Clara said. "I am continuing it." The simplicity and the sorrow and the determination in those 5 words hit Seth somewhere behind his sternum, and he sat with the weight of them for a moment before he said, "The bird with the red breast you'll see here in spring is a robin. They come back every year." Clara wrote that down. She would add it to the page, he thought, next to whatever her father had last written, and something about that felt important. He did not see Alice that day. He sat on the step with Clara until the girl decided the waiting was done and went inside, and then Seth got up and walked back to his room at the boarding house and sat on his bed and thought about things for a long time without reaching any particular conclusion. On a Thursday in the second week of October, he saw Alice Kendrick crying. He had not meant to see it. He was passing the alley beside the dry goods store when he heard the sound. Very quiet, very controlled. The kind of crying that comes from a woman who has made a rule about not crying where people can see her, and has ducked into an alley because she needed 30 seconds of not following that rule. He stopped at the entrance to the alley without announcing himself, because he did not know what the right thing was, and he stood there and listened to her compose herself. And by the time he had decided he should probably move on before she came out and found him standing there like a statue, she came out and nearly walked into him. She looked up at him. Her eyes were red at the edges, and she had her jaw set in the particular way he was coming to recognize as Alice Kendrick not allowing herself to fall apart in public. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "Don't be," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you are," he said. "You don't have to be, though." The simple, matter-of-fact delivery of that sentence seemed to catch her off guard in a way nothing else had. She looked at him for a moment in which several things moved across her face that she probably would have preferred not to show. Then she pressed her lips together and nodded once and walked past him and back through the front door of the store. Seth stood in the street for a moment. He was not a man who said the right thing often. He was not sure he had this time. But the look on her face when he'd said it made him think that maybe what she had needed was not a right thing or a wrong thing, but simply a true one, said without flinching. He started bringing Clara bird books. Not formally, not as gifts presented with ceremony. He simply found them at the second-hand shop that Elias Crow ran out of his back room, a cluttered, dusty, glorious place where drovers sold books they'd carried too far, and he would find one with good illustrations and leave it on the front step with no note, and Clara would find it and add it to her collection. After the second one, Alice came to find him at the livery. She walked in with the book in her hand and looked at him across a horse he was currently persuading out of a bad habit and said, "Seth Graves, are you leaving books for my daughter?" He continued working the horse. "That depends on whether you plan to tell me to stop." She stood there and he felt her eyes on the back of his neck, which was a new and not uncomfortable sensation. "She knows the names of 14 birds now," she said finally. "She draws them well," he said. A pause. "How would you know that?" "She showed me her notebook," he said. "On a Saturday about 3 weeks ago." Another pause. "She has not told me that." "We were waiting," he said, which probably made no sense out of context. But Alice said she does that. She sits and waits, and she says she doesn't know what for. "She said it's interesting," Seth said, not knowing. The silence that followed was warmer than most of the silences he had lived in for the past 3 years. Alice set the book on a clean part of the fence rail and said, "I am going to make beef stew tonight. There is enough for 3. She said it the way a woman says something when she has thought about saying it for a while and has decided to say it directly because anything else would take too long. "If you are interested." He thought about saying no. He thought about his boarding house room and the plate of whatever Mrs. Harlow left covered on the sideboard and the silence that was comfortable but was also, at this point, just empty. He thought about 3 years of keeping walking. "What time?" he asked. She smiled. It was not the complicated smile from the counter. It was a real one, quick and warm, gone almost before it arrived. 6 o'clock, she said, and she walked out of the livery. He was there at 5 minutes to 6 with his hat in his hands and his good shirt, which was a dark blue that he had not worn in 8 months, and Clara answered the door and looked at the shirt and then at his face and said with absolute sincerity, "You look different." "Better or worse?" he asked. "Better," she decided and stepped back to let him in. The room above the dry goods store was small, but Alice had made it warm. She had put a piece of calico over the table, and there was a lamp burning low, and the stew was on the stove, and the smell of it was the smell of something real and homemade and deeply, specifically good. Seth Graves stood in the doorway of that small room and felt something land in his chest that he had no immediate word for. They ate and Clara talked about birds and the arithmetic she was being taught by the schoolteacher, Mrs. Reardon, and whether the plains were formed by an ancient sea, which she had read about in one of the natural history books. And Seth answered when he was asked and offered things when he had them and did not perform. And he noticed that Alice watched him the way she watched things she was trying to understand, with that careful, quiet attention that was not judgmental, only thorough. After Clara was in bed, they sat at the table with coffee, and Alice asked him something no one in Caldwell had ever asked him. She asked him where he was from, not in the way of polite conversation, in the way of someone who actually wanted to know. He was from Missouri, he told her. A farm, the same as everyone, it seemed, in this part of the world. His father had been a difficult man, and his mother had been a patient one, and he had left at 19 with a horse and a rifle and no particular plan. He had drifted west and worked cattle and learned that his size was useful, and that his silence made people uncomfortable, which occasionally also made it useful, and he had ended up in Caldwell, Kansas, because the work was steady and the questions were few. "Do you have family?" she asked. "A brother in St. Louis. We don't write." "Why not?" He looked at his coffee. "We are very different," he said, which was true and was also not all of it, but Alice seemed to hear the not all of it and did not press, just nodded in the way of someone filing that information carefully. "I had a sister," she said, "in Ohio. She died when she was 12 of scarlet fever. My mother never quite came back from it. My father did his best." A pause. "We came west because Thomas believed in it, in the land, in the idea that you could build something that belonged to you." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I believe in it too. I just have to find a new way to do the building." Seth looked at her across the small table and thought about building and loss, and what it meant to keep moving towards something when the original shape of the thing was gone. He thought she was one of the strongest people he had met, and he had met hard men, men who had survived things that would break the average person, and she sat here in her small room above the dry goods store with her 7-year-old daughter and her husband's Bible and her plans for a new shape. And she was not pretending it was easy, and she was not giving up. And something about that was more moving to him than anything he had encountered in years. He did not say any of that. But she seemed to read some of it in his face anyway, because she looked at him for a moment with an expression that was soft and a little wondering, and then she looked back down at her coffee. He left at 8:30, which was proper, and she walked him to the door and he put on his hat and she said, "Thank you for coming," and he said, "Thank you for the stew," and neither of those things was entirely about the stew or the coming, and they both knew it. November arrived cold and sharp, and Seth began to understand that he was in considerable trouble. He thought about Alice Kendrick when he was working. He thought about her careful way of talking and the sound of her laugh, which he had heard twice now, both times when Clara said something unexpectedly funny, and it was a good laugh, full and honest. He thought about the way she held the Bible and the way she had looked at him in the alley, and the way she had said there is enough for three as though it were a simple observation about food, and not the bravest thing she'd said to him yet. He was not a man who spoke about such things. He had been close to a woman before, in the years when he'd been younger and less careful, and it had ended badly, not through cruelty but through the particular incompatibility of two people who wanted different lives, and had waited too long to admit it. He had come away from that believing, with the calm confidence of someone who has learned a hard lesson thoroughly, that he was not a man built for the domestic warmth of the thing. He was too rough, too quiet, too accustomed to his own company. But Alice was not asking him to be anything he wasn't. She did not look at him the way women sometimes looked at men they wanted to smooth out or fix. She looked at him the way she looked at her natural history books, with genuine curiosity and something close to respect. He was at the dry goods store 3 evenings a week by the middle of November, having dinner with Alice and Clara, and he told himself each time that this was the last time. And each time Clara showed him something she had drawn or Alice asked him a question he had not expected, and he stayed, and it got later, and when he walked back through the cold to the boarding house, the cold felt colder than it had before, the way distance feels greater when you've been somewhere warm. Margaret Holt watched all of this from behind her counter with the patience of a woman who knew something was in motion and did not require it to go any faster. The first time Seth touched Alice was an accident in every technical sense. She was reaching for a jar on the top shelf of the small kitchen cabinet, and he was handing her a plate he'd dried from the dishes, and he did not step back quite far enough, and she turned, and her hand came down on his arm for balance, and they stood that way for a moment, very close, her hand on his forearm and his face near her hair, which smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet, and neither of them moved for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to be something. Then she took the jar and stepped back and said, "Preserves." "Clara wants preserves on her bread tomorrow," and her voice was steady but slightly lower than usual, and Seth set the plate on the counter and said, "That sounds reasonable," and his own voice was not entirely steady either. He lay awake for 2 hours that night thinking about that moment and what it meant and what he was doing and whether he was a fool. He was, he decided, probably a fool, but he was a fool who was going to go back on Thursday. The trouble came in the second week of November in the form of a man named Beau Craddock, who had ridden into Caldwell with a cattle drive and had no intentions of riding out again any time soon. Craddock was large and loud, and he had money from the drive, and he spent it at the Longhorn Saloon in the way of a man who wanted everyone to know he had it. He was not the worst man in Caldwell, not by a long distance, but he was the kind of man who looked at a widow running a store and saw something available, and he had begun stopping by the dry goods store with a regularity that made the back of Alice's neck tense. Seth found out about it from Clara, who told him matter-of-factly on a Tuesday afternoon that a man with a loud voice had offered to take her mother to dinner, and her mother had said no 3 times, and the man had smiled like he hadn't heard her. Seth went into the dry goods store on Wednesday. Craddock was there at the counter, leaning on it with his hat pushed back, talking to Alice in that particular way that men talked to women when they had decided the conversation was going to end the way they wanted regardless of what the woman said. Alice was polite and closed, and very clearly wishing Craddock would evaporate. Seth came up to the counter and said, without inflection, "Alice, I came to see if you needed anything brought in before the weather turns." Craddock looked at him. Seth looked at Craddock. It was a brief, precise exchange of information, the kind that men who have both lived rough lives have efficiently. Craddock absorbed the information, took a long look at Seth's shoulders and the particular flatness of his expression, and decided he had other business elsewhere. He straightened up from the counter, nodded at Alice with the performance of a man who was leaving on his own schedule, and walked out. Alice waited until the door closed. Then she let out a long breath. "Thank you," she said. She was looking at the door, not at him. "Has he been bothering you?" "He has been persistent," she said, which was the polite word for it. She turned to look at Seth, and there was something in her expression that was complicated, some mixture of gratitude and irritation that was not at Seth, but at the general situation of being a woman alone in a territory where aloneness was sometimes read as openness. "I am capable of managing difficult men," she said. "I have been doing it." "I know you are," Seth said, and he meant it. "I just happen to be here." She looked at him for a moment. "You just happen to be here," she repeated, and there was a quality in her voice that suggested she did not entirely believe the word happened. He looked at the shelf behind her. "Do you need anything brought in before the weather turns?" he asked, and she laughed, and it was the good laugh, the real one, and it filled up the small space between them like light. December came. The first snow fell on a Monday, light and exploratory, dusting the rooftops and disappearing by afternoon. Seth found that he had, at some point in the past 6 weeks, stopped telling himself this was the last time. He had simply stopped. The conversation had become unnecessary. He was helping Alice and Clara now in ways that went beyond the original scope of firewood and bed frames. He had fixed the window latch on their room that didn't close properly. He had looked at the small wood-burning stove and determined that the flue was partially blocked and cleared it, which improved the heat considerably. He had found, at Elias Crow's second-hand shop, a bird identification guide specifically for the Kansas plains, and he had given it to Clara formally this time, as a gift, with his name written in the front because she'd asked him to. He knew he was falling in love with Alice Kendrick. He knew it the way you know a winter is coming, not in a single moment but in the accumulation of signs until the thing itself is undeniable. He knew it in the particular way his chest felt when she smiled at something he said. He knew it in the way he noticed when she was tired and wanted to say something about it and held back. He knew it when Clara showed him a new drawing, and his first thought was to see Alice's face when she saw it. He did not know what to do about it. He was Seth Graves. He was the roughest man in the territory, which was a joke by this point, a character he had built around himself like a fence, and the fence had been useful, but it did not currently feel like something he wanted to maintain. But the other side of it was the territory he did not know, and that territory contained the specific risk of Alice Kendrick looking at him and finding something not worth holding on to, and that risk felt large enough that he could not quite see the edges of it. He came to dinner on a Friday in December, and Alice had made apple cake. It was an event. Clara announced it from the door before he was even fully in the room, bouncing on her heels with an uncharacteristic glee that showed itself exactly when she was very happy. The apple cake was on the table, and the room smelled of cinnamon, and the stove was burning well, throwing warm yellow light, and Alice was wearing the green dress he had not seen before, the one that matched her eyes in a way that should probably have been illegal, and she looked at him when he came in with something in her expression that was not quite the usual welcome. It was softer than the usual welcome. It had a quality of expectation in it that he could not quite name. They ate the stew she had made first, and the apple cake after, and Clara ate 2 pieces and declared it better than anything she had eaten in her entire life, which at 7 years old was a shorter body of evidence than she appeared to realize but was heartfelt. And Alice laughed. And Seth ate his cake and watched Alice and thought there was nowhere in the world he would rather be. Clara fell asleep at the table which she would deny to her dying day, and Alice carried her to bed and came back, and they sat with the last of the cake and the coffee and the fire and the comfortable silence that had come to be their particular kind of silence, the kind built between people who were used to each other. "Seth," Alice said. She was looking at her coffee cup. He waited. She looked up at him. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if you think the honest answer will be uncomfortable." "All right," he said. "Why do you come here?" she asked. "To dinner, every week. What is it that you are coming for?" It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him, which was saying something, because Alice Kendrick was not an indirect woman. He understood that she was not asking it casually. He understood that she had been thinking about it and had decided she needed to know. He looked at her across the table. He thought about all the things he could say that would be technically true and leave him some protected middle ground. He thought about the fence he'd built and how long he'd been building it. "You," he said. "I come for you." The silence that followed that was different from all their other silences. Alice looked at him with those green eyes, and he could see her reading what he'd said and what it meant, and taking it seriously the way she took everything seriously. And then she said, very quietly, "I have been hoping that was the answer." Seth sat with that for a moment. He looked at her face, open and careful and a little nervous in a way he had not seen on Alice Kendrick before, because she was not a nervous woman, and the fact that she was nervous about this told him something important. "Alice," he said, and his voice came out lower than usual. "Yes," she said. "I have been trying to work out whether I'm the right kind of man for a woman like you," he said. "I have not been coming to any very confident conclusions." She tilted her head. "A woman like me," she repeated. "What does that mean exactly?" "You are good," he said. "You are good, and you are smart, and you have a daughter, and you have already had one life, and you are building another one, and I don't know whether I fit into the shape of the thing you're building." Alice looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that cut through 3 years of distance and self-imposed exile, in exactly the way a true thing does when it finds the right place to land. "Seth Graves, I have been watching you for 2 months. I have watched you carry everything I own without being asked. I have watched you sit on a step with my daughter and teach her about song sparrows. I have watched you fix my window and clear my flue and leave books with no note because you did not want to make it into a thing. And you want to tell me you don't know if you fit." A pause. "You fit," she said. "You fit in a way I was not expecting and I was not entirely ready for, and I will confess is a little frightening, but it's true." Seth Graves looked at Alice Kendrick across a small table in a room above a dry goods store in Caldwell, Kansas, in December of 1878, and felt the last of the fence come down. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his carefully, the way he'd carried the Bible on the first day, like something that mattered. She turned her hand over and held his. "I am not easy to know," he said. "I do not have much practice at it." "I am not particularly easy either," she said. "I have opinions about everything and I will say them." "I know," he said. "I like that about you." She smiled, and it was the real smile, the full one, and it went all the way to her eyes, and Seth thought he had not seen anything better in 31 years of looking. He did not kiss her that night. He held her hand across the table while the fire burned down and they talked until the lamp needed refilling, and when he left, he held her hand a moment longer at the door, and she looked up at him with those green eyes, and he thought, "I am not going to be able to stay away from this." He was right about that. Christmas in Caldwell, Kansas in 1878 was a practical affair with pockets of genuine warmth. Margaret Holt decorated the dry goods store with pine branches she had one of the drovers bring in from the creek bottoms, and Alice had strung a few small pieces of colored glass in the window of their room that caught the winter light and threw little rainbows on the wall, and Clara declared this the finest thing she had ever seen, which was a high bar given the apple cake. Seth had never spent Christmas with anyone in Caldwell. He had been, in previous years, at the Longhorn Saloon, nursing a drink and watching other men be merry with a detachment that was almost anthropological. He found that he did not miss that at all. He came on Christmas Eve with a small pine branch he'd tied with a piece of red ribbon, because he had seen Alice looking at the decorations in the store window, and he had noted, with the particular attention he paid to things she looked at, that she seemed pleased by them. He had also made, with his own hands and more concentration than he had spent on anything in recent memory, a small carved wooden bird for Clara. He had found a piece of good white pine, and had worked at it in the evenings in his room with a knife and a patience that surprised him, and the finished bird was small and neat and recognizable as a song sparrow if you knew what to look for, which Clara most certainly did. He was almost embarrassed about both things before he got to the door, and then he knocked and Clara opened the door and saw the carved bird in his hand, and her face did something that made him entirely stop being embarrassed. She took it very carefully and looked at it from every angle and said, in a voice that was very quiet for Clara, "It has the streak on the breast and the dark spot." "Yes," he said. She looked up at him. "Thank you, Seth," she said, and it was the first time she had called him by his name without the formal Mister in front of it, and he felt that like the carved bird must have felt the first touch of the knife, precise and significant. Alice was in the doorway behind Clara, and she looked at the bird and then at Seth, and her eyes were bright, and she said, very softly, "Come in," and he went in. They spent Christmas Eve together, and it was a quiet and profoundly happy evening, the kind of evening that you do not realize is the most important kind until you are older and looking back. They told stories. Seth, who almost never told stories, told a story about a horse he had broken that had turned out to be the most intelligent and devious animal he had encountered in his life, who had learned to unlatch gates and had once let every horse in the livery out onto Main Street. And Alice laughed until she pressed her hand over her mouth, and Clara demanded every detail. Alice told about Ohio, about the first winter she and Thomas had spent in Kansas when the wind came down from the north, and she had genuinely not believed anything could be that cold, and how Thomas had been calm and practical and had set about solving each problem as it came, and how she had watched him and thought, "I can do this. I can be that kind of person too." Seth listened to her talk about Thomas without difficulty. It had come to him somewhere in November that Thomas Kendrick was not a rival or a ghost or a shadow over his hopes. Thomas Kendrick was the man who had loved Alice first and given her Clara and taught her that a good man was possible, and Seth found that he was grateful to that man, quietly and specifically, for the template he had left. He kissed her for the first time on Christmas Eve. Clara had gone to sleep in the rocking chair the way she sometimes did, bird book open on her lap, and Alice had looked over at her daughter with that expression she wore when Clara wasn't watching, that open, uncomplicated love, and Seth was sitting close enough to her that when she turned back from looking at Clara, they were nearer than they usually were. She did not move back. He did not move back. He looked at her for a long moment in which everything was very clear and very still. And then he kissed her, gently, and with the care he had been putting into everything connected to Alice Kendrick since the first morning, and she kissed him back, her hand coming up to his jaw, and it was not a complicated kiss or a long one, but it was real. The way everything between them had been real from the beginning, without performance or pretense. When he pulled back, she looked at him with her eyes still closed for a moment, and then she opened them and said, "I have been waiting for that for some time." "I know," he said. "I was slow." "You were," she agreed, but she was smiling. January came with its full weight, the kind of January that Kansas specializes in, weeks of iron-gray sky and wind that cut sideways off the plains and temperatures that dropped hard at night and stayed down. The town of Caldwell pulled inward the way frontier towns did in winter, the streets emptier, the saloon busier in inverse proportion, and people found their warmth where they could. Seth and Alice found theirs. He was at the dry goods store most evenings now, with no pretense of occasion required. He would come after work, dinner would be made or they would make it together, and Clara would do her lessons at the table and contribute to the conversation with the impartial frequency of a child who had decided this was a normal thing and did not require comment. Seth had moved so naturally into the rhythm of their evenings that Margaret Holt had stopped remarking on it and started simply setting 3 cups when she heard his boots on the stairs. He and Alice talked about everything. He was surprised, still, by the range of things he had to say when someone was genuinely interested in the answer. He talked about cattle and the Kisham Trail and the particular psychology of horses and the way weather moved across the plains. And she talked about land and books and the school she wanted Clara to attend and the way she thought the territory was going to change in the next 20 years as the railroad came through more thoroughly. They talked about what she wanted to build and what he wanted to do, and at some point in those conversations, it stopped being 2 individual futures and started being a shared geography that they were both mapping out. He told her about his brother in St. Louis, which he had not told anyone. Eli Graves, 2 years younger, a businessman with a city life and a wife and 3 children, and a particular way of looking at Seth that had always made Seth feel like a problem that had not been properly solved. They had not spoken in 4 years. The falling out had been over their father, over what happened after their mother died, and it was a wound that had calcified into something Seth had decided he could live without feeling. "Do you want to repair it?" Alice asked. He thought about it. "I do not know," he said honestly. "I have been avoiding the question." "Maybe it is time to stop avoiding it," she said. "Not a demand, not a judgment. Just an observation from a woman who had lost enough people to understand the math of it." He thought about that for a week. He thought about it while he was working, the question surfacing and submerging, and at the end of the week he sat down at the table in his boarding house room and wrote Eli a letter. Not a long one, not one that tried to resolve everything, just a letter that said, "I am in Caldwell, Kansas. I am doing well. I have been thinking about you." He did not know if Eli would write back. He thought that was all right. He had sent the thing, and that was the part he could control. He showed Alice the letter before he sent it. She read it and looked up and said, "That is exactly right," and folded it back up and handed it to him. He sent it the next morning. The question of the future moved through January and February like a river working its way under ice, steady and certain even when it wasn't visible. Seth had never planned for a future in any serious way. He had always moved from where he was to the next place without building any permanent stake in either location. Caldwell was the longest he had stayed anywhere since Missouri, and he had stayed because the work was steady, and because he had been tired of moving. He understood now that the real reason he had not left was standing at a kitchen stove in a room above the dry goods store, talking to her daughter about birds. February brought a thaw, brief and deceitful the way February thaws are, 2 days of warmth that got everyone's hope up before the cold came back. On one of those warm days, Seth and Alice and Clara walked out to the edge of town where the plains opened up, Clara with her bird book and her notebook, Seth and Alice walking side by side in the particular way they had developed, close enough to almost touch. Clara ran ahead looking for birds, and they were alone in the way you can be alone in a wide open space when the nearest other person is 20 feet away and fully occupied. "What are you thinking about?" Alice asked, because she had developed the habit of asking this and he had developed the habit of answering it honestly. "This," he said, which was not very specific. She waited. "You and Clara," he said, "what we're building. Whether it's something you want to build with me in it, or whether that's something I've been assuming." Alice stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She turned to look at him, the winter sun behind her, her hair loose at her temples where the wind had pulled it, and she said, "Seth Graves, what exactly are you asking?" He looked at her. He was 31 years old and had slept in more bunkhouses than he could count and had done things in his youth that he was not proud of, and had spent 3 years deliberately making himself unavailable to the world, and none of that had prepared him in the slightest for this particular moment. But he was also a man who had learned recently that the cost of not saying the thing was higher than the cost of saying it. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would consider marrying me." The wind moved across the grass. Clara, 20 feet away, startled a meadowlark that flew up in a burst of yellow and brown. Alice looked at him for a long moment, and he was very still, the way he was still when he was waiting for something important. "I would," she said. "I would consider it very seriously." A pause. "I would consider it done." He smiled. It was not a small smile. It was the real one, the one that very few people in Caldwell had ever seen, and it changed his face in a way that made Alice's breath catch. She reached up and put her hand on his jaw and said, "There you are. I knew you were in there somewhere." He covered her hand with his and turned his face into her palm for a moment, and across the grass, Clara looked up from her notebook and assessed the situation with 7-year-old accuracy, and went back to her birds with a satisfaction that she would later in life be unable to completely explain. They told Clara that evening. Alice sat her down at the table and explained, with the careful honesty she always used with her daughter, that Seth had asked Alice to marry him and Alice had said yes, and that this would mean Seth would become part of their family. And what did Clara think about that? Clara thought about it for exactly the length of time it took her to eat the last piece of bread on her plate. Then she said, "Does this mean Seth will live with us?" "Yes," Alice said. "Good," Clara said. "He knows more about birds than anyone I have ever met." She considered further. "Also, he is good at carrying things and fixing things, and I think it will be useful to have someone tall." She looked at Seth. "I think this is a good idea." Seth looked at this child, serious and warm and utterly herself, and he said, "I think so too," and he meant it with more of himself than he would have thought possible 4 months earlier. The news in Caldwell traveled the way news traveled in small frontier towns, which is to say immediately and in all directions. Margaret Holt, who had watched the whole thing develop from the closest range, received the news with a composure that only cracked into a very wide smile when she was alone in the back room. The men at the livery offered Seth congratulations with the somewhat baffled respect of men who had not expected this development, and were not entirely sure what to do with it. At the Longhorn Saloon, the barman, a solid man named Dutch, poured Seth a drink on the house and said, with the gravity of a man making an important pronouncement, "You found a good one, Graves." "I know it," Seth said. Bo Craddock had long since left Caldwell with the next cattle drive north, which Seth considered a satisfactory resolution. They were married in March of 1879, in the small white church at the end of Caldwell's Main Street, by a minister named Reverend Albright, who had been in the territory for 15 years, and had married couples under conditions ranging from the conventional to the genuinely remarkable, and who said afterward that this wedding had been one of his more particular favorites, because both parties had said their vows with the complete sincerity of people who had thought about every word. Alice wore a dress of dark blue wool, the nicest thing she owned, with her hair down and pinned back with a comb that had been her mother's, and she stood at the front of the church and looked at Seth with those green eyes, and said her vows in the clear, direct voice she used for things she meant. And Seth said his in the low, steady voice of a man who had thought about every word and had found, to his own surprise, that they were all true. Clara sat in the front pew next to Margaret Holt, holding her bird book, wearing her best dress, and when the minister pronounced them married and Seth bent to kiss his wife, Clara turned to Margaret and said matter-of-factly, "I knew he was very large for a reason." And Margaret Holt laughed outright, which was a sound not often heard in the church, and everyone in the small congregation smiled. After the ceremony, Margaret Holt organized a meal at the dry goods store, which she had closed for the afternoon, and decorated with more pine branches and some paper flowers that she had made herself over the previous 2 weeks. Half the town came, or what passed for half in Caldwell, and Dutch the barman brought over a case of decent wine which he said was a wedding gift, and old Hector Prout arrived from 20 miles east having made the journey specifically, and shook Seth's hand with the grip of a farmer who had worked the land for 40 years and said, "You take care of them," and Seth said, "That is the only plan I have," and Hector nodded as though that was entirely satisfactory. The spring came in earnest after the wedding, the plains greening up as they did, the meadowlarks returning, the days stretching longer, and Seth Graves moved his few possessions into the room above the dry goods store, and found that, for a man who had spent 3 years accumulating very little, those few possessions fit without difficulty into a life that felt, with a completeness he had not expected, like the right size for him. There was a question of the future that they had begun discussing seriously in the evenings. Alice with her organized mind and her ledger habits, and Seth with his knowledge of land and cattle, and what was possible in the territory. The room above the dry goods store was comfortable but small for 3 people, and the conversation about what came next had been happening in pieces for weeks. A letter arrived from Seth's brother Eli in April. He had not expected it. He had sent his own letter in January, and had left the outcome to whatever the outcome was going to be. And now here was a letter in Eli's tight, precise handwriting on good paper from St. Louis, and Seth sat at the table with Alice beside him and read it. Eli wrote that he had been glad to hear from Seth, that he had thought about their last conversation, which had been more of a confrontation, and had thought about it for 4 years, and that he had not handled himself as well as he should have, that he had 3 children now, 2 boys and a girl, and that his wife Catherine was well, that he was running a dry goods distribution business in St. Louis that was doing all right, that he had heard Seth was in Kansas and had wondered, once in a while, whether he was safe. At the end, Eli wrote, "I hear you have married. I would like to meet her, if you are willing." Seth sat with the letter for a long time. Alice sat beside him and did not say anything, which was one of the things he loved about her, the way she knew when words were not the tool required. "He wants to come to Kansas," Seth said finally. "I read that," Alice said. "I do not know how I feel about it," he said. "Which part?" "Any of it." A pause. "All of it." He set the letter on the table. "I have been angry with my brother for 4 years, and I have been carrying it the way you carry something heavy when you've forgotten you're carrying it. And now here is this letter, and I am not sure what I have left when I put the anger down." Alice looked at him. "You have your brother," she said, "and he appears to want you back." Seth looked out the window at the spring sky. He thought about his mother, who had been a patient woman and had always believed her sons would work it out. He thought she would probably have liked Alice very much. "Write him back," Seth said. "He can come in August." Alice smiled and covered his hand with hers. "I will write him," she said. "I have better handwriting." "That is almost certainly true," Seth said. May and June were good months. Seth had taken on steady work at a larger ranch outside of Caldwell, the Cooper Ranch, owned by a man named James Cooper, who was expanding his cattle operation and needed a foreman with experience and a steady head. The pay was better than the livery work and the hours were more structured, and it was the first time Seth had taken on a role that suggested something other than passing through. He was very good at it. He had the natural authority of a man that other men believed when he spoke, not because of the size and the roughness, though that helped, but because he was competent and fair, and he knew cattle the way some men know a language, from the inside, fluently and without effort. Cooper noticed this and raised his pay in June, which Seth brought home and told Alice about with a straightforwardness that she found endearing, because he was not boastful. He was simply reporting the news, and the news was good. They found land in June, not far from Caldwell, 8 miles east, 40 acres with a creek and good soil that had been resting for 2 years since the previous occupant had given up and gone back to Missouri. Seth looked at it with Alice on a Sunday afternoon, walking the boundaries, Alice calculating what could be planted, Seth assessing the water and the access road and the state of the soil, Clara running along the creek bank looking for birds she hadn't identified yet and announcing each discovery. "It's good land," Seth said. "It is," Alice said. She stood at the edge of what would be the kitchen garden and looked out across the acres. He watched her face as she looked at it and saw the thing he had seen in her from the beginning, that forward-moving determination, the rebuilding shape of her. "This is what you've been building toward," he said. It was not a question. "We have been building toward it," she said, and she looked at him and meant it. He bought the land with his savings and her savings combined, and they shook hands with a man from the land office in Caldwell named Garrett who had very small hands and very tidy records. And Alice signed her name on the deed next to Seth's, and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a woman who is recognizing something she has been trying to find for a long time. Building the house took the summer. Seth did most of the construction himself, with help on the heavier work from a few of the Cooper Ranch hands who came on Saturdays, good men named Tom Riley, and a younger man called Webb who was 19 and very willing though somewhat overconfident with a hammer. They built it solid, 2 rooms to start, with space to add, good timber frame walls and a proper roof, and a stone fireplace that Seth laid himself with the same careful thoroughness he brought to everything he valued. Eli arrived in August. He came on the eastbound train, a man of 29 with Seth's dark hair but none of Seth's size, lean and neat in a good city coat, with a way of looking at things that Seth recognized as their mother's habit of assessment. He came alone, his wife Catherine and the children remaining in St. Louis for the trip's exploratory nature. They met at the Caldwell station, which was a simple wooden platform, and the first minute was the awkward, careful minute of 2 men who had not seen each other in 4 years, and had a great deal of history between them that was not yet fully classified. Then Eli looked at his brother and said, with a simplicity that cut through everything, "You look good, Seth. You look better than you've looked in a long time." Seth looked at his brother. "You look like a city man," he said. Eli smiled. It was a small smile that had their mother in it. "I am a city man," he said. "That was never going to change." They shook hands and the handshake held a moment, and then Seth put his hand on his brother's shoulder briefly, and that was enough for now. Alice met Eli with the directness she brought to everything, and within 20 minutes had asked him 3 pointed questions about his distribution business, and offered 2 observations that made Eli look at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to be intellectually engaged, and was very pleasantly surprised to be. Clara shook Eli's hand formally and said, "Are you going to look at the house?" Seth built most of it himself. It was the highest form of recommendation in her scale of values. The visit was 4 days. They ate together and talked about their father and the farm in Missouri, and Seth said things he had been carrying for 4 years, and Eli listened, and said his own things, and they did not resolve everything, because some things cannot be resolved, only acknowledged and folded into a shape that is livable. But by the end of the 4 days they had exchanged addresses and made arrangements for letters, and when Eli left on the eastbound train, he clasped Seth's hand and said, "Bring Alice and Clara to St. Louis next year." And Seth said he would consider it, which for Seth Graves was more than halfway to a yes. They moved into the house in September of 1879, exactly 1 year after Alice had arrived in Caldwell with everything she owned in a borrowed wagon, and had asked the roughest man in the territory to carry one small thing. The house was not grand. It was 2 solid rooms with good walls and a real fireplace, and a kitchen that Alice had opinions about, and Seth had built to those exact specifications. And it sat on their 40 acres beside the creek with a barn behind it, and a kitchen garden in front that Alice planted in the fall for the spring to come. Clara had her own small room built off the main room, just large enough for her bed and her books, and a table where she could draw, and she spent the first evening in it writing a list of all the birds she planned to look for on the property, which came to 27 species, some of which Seth pointed out were not found in this part of Kansas. "Yet," Clara said, with the certainty of someone who believes that sufficient observation will eventually produce any result. Seth looked at Alice over Clara's head, and Alice pressed her lips together in the way she did, when she was suppressing a smile about something she was also genuinely proud of. That first night in the house, after Clara was asleep and the fire in the fireplace was burning low and orange, Alice and Seth sat together in the chair he had built, which was large enough for one person in most circumstances and two people in the circumstances of a couple who had no objections to being close. And Alice leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat and watched the fire and did not talk for a long while. "We did this," Alice said eventually. "We did," he agreed. She turned her head to look at him. "A year ago I asked you to carry one thing." "I remember," he said. "You carried everything," she said. He looked at her. "There was not another reasonable option." She smiled, and he kissed her, and the fire burned. And outside the Kansas sky was full of stars, millions of them, a width of stars that you only get in places where there is nothing between you and the sky. And the creek made its small sound, and the horse in the new barn shifted, and the plains were quiet in the way that the plains are quiet when nothing is wrong. Spring arrived on the new land with a generosity that felt, to Alice, almost personal. The kitchen garden came up early and strong, and the field that Seth had broken and planted in winter wheat showed green and steady, and the creek was full from a good snowmelt. And Clara found 12 new bird species in the first month of spring, including a burrowing owl that she spent 3 days sketching from every angle. Alice was expecting their first child by April, which she told Seth on a Monday morning in the direct way she had of saying important things, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee in her hands. And Seth received this news with the particular stillness of a man who is very moved and is not entirely sure what to do with the scale of it. He set down his coffee very carefully. He looked at Alice. He said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, and she looked at him, looking at her, and said, "Seth Graves, do not get quiet on me now." "I am not quiet," he said. "I am thinking about how good this is." She turned her hands over and held his. "It is very good," she agreed. He was at every stage of that pregnancy in the way that the best men of any era are, present and practical and attentive without hovering, finding ways to make things easier without suggesting she needed help she had not asked for. He drove her to Caldwell for the doctor's appointments, a physician named Dr. Marsh who had a good reputation and steady hands. He did the heavier work of the farm without being asked and did not make a ceremony of it. He sat with her in the evenings when she was tired and talked with her about the baby and what they hoped for and what they planned. Clara had strong opinions about the baby, including a preferred name, which she had selected from a list she had compiled and justified with written reasoning, which Alice read with the expression of a woman who found her daughter both exhausting and miraculous in almost equal measure. The baby was born in November 1880, on a Tuesday morning with a cold wind outside and a warm fire inside, and Dr. Marsh doing his competent work and Seth in the next room doing the hardest thing he had ever done, which was waiting. Mrs. Reardon, the schoolteacher who had become a friend of Alice's, sat with him and knitted and occasionally said something sensible when he started to look too wound up, and when Dr. Marsh opened the door and said, "Graves, you have a son." Seth stood up so quickly he knocked the chair back, and Mrs. Reardon caught it and said, "Go on then," with a smile. His son was small and red, and had his mother's green eyes from the very first day, which was Seth's observation when he sat beside Alice's bed holding the baby for the first time with a carefulness so extreme that Alice said, very gently, "He will not break, Seth." "I know," Seth said, not taking his eyes off his son. "What do you think?" Alice asked. Seth looked at her, his wife, who was tired and warm, and watching him hold their child with an expression that was one of the finest things he had ever seen. "I think," he said, "that this is the best thing I have ever done." "We," she said. "We," he agreed. They named him James Thomas Graves. James for no particular reason except that it was a solid name and they both liked it. Thomas because it was right, and because Alice had thought about it carefully and had said that Thomas would have wanted his name to go forward in the world, and Seth had agreed that this was the kind of man Thomas Kendrick sounded like. Clara, presented with her brother, examined him with a thoroughness she reserved for new birds and new books and said, "He is very small. Will he get large like Seth?" And Alice said probably, and Clara accepted this and went back to her drawing, though she spent the next week checking on James with a frequency that nobody remarked on, because it was clearly the behavior of someone who was more interested than she was willing to admit. The news went to Eli and Catherine in St. Louis in a letter Alice wrote, and Eli wrote back immediately and enthusiastically, and his wife Catherine sent a small package containing a baby blanket she had made herself in blue wool. And this small gesture cracked something in Seth that had been mostly healed but not entirely, and he sat at the kitchen table reading Catherine's note and was quiet for a while. "He is your family," Alice said, sitting down across from him. "All of them are." "I know it," Seth said. "It is not a weakness to let people in," she said. "I know you know that." He looked at her. "I know it better than I did," he said. "You showed me." She reached across and covered his hand with hers, the way she always had, and he turned his hand over and held hers, the way he always did, and the baby slept in the next room in the crib Seth had built, and Clara was doing her arithmetic at the table, and the fire was burning, and outside the Kansas plains were doing their quiet, enormous thing. They visited Eli in St. Louis in the spring of 1881. Seth had been to St. Louis years ago, passing through, and it had felt foreign and loud and fast. He went this time with Alice beside him and James in her arms, and Clara wide-eyed at the window of the train compartment, and found that the foreignness was still there, but the loudness did not bother him the way it had, because he was not looking for a reason to keep moving. Eli's house was a good house in a quiet street, and Catherine turned out to be exactly as warm and capable and direct as her letter had suggested, and she and Alice recognized each other in the way of women who understand exactly who they are and do not need to establish it. Seth and Eli sat in Eli's study on the second evening and drank good whiskey and talked about their father, really talked, going into the parts they had not been able to reach in August. And the whiskey helped, and the time helped, and by the end of it, they had reached a place that was not quite forgiveness and was not quite resolution, but was, honestly, acceptance, which is sometimes the most livable version of those things. Seth came back to Kansas with his brother restored, not perfectly, not as they had been as children before everything complicated, but as adult men who had made their own lives and could look at each other from across those lives and still find someone worth knowing. Alice watched him on the train home, James asleep against his chest, Clara asleep against his arm, and she thought about the morning in September of 1878 when she had come down Main Street in a borrowed wagon with everything she owned, and a man in a dark coat had stopped walking when her daughter said he was very large. And she thought about what she had known and what she had not known, and how the knowing had built up so gradually and so inevitably that it was impossible now to find the moment when it had become certain. She leaned her head against Seth's shoulder, and he tilted his head down to touch hers, and outside the train window Kansas went by in the afternoon light, gold and enormous. The years that followed were good years, the kind of good years that are not made of spectacular events, but of the accumulation of ordinary things that are, when you look at them directly, extraordinary. The farm grew. Seth added 20 more acres in 1882 with a second good harvest. The house grew with it, a proper second room added in 1883 when Alice told him over breakfast on a Wednesday morning that they were going to need it, and Seth looked at her across the table with that smile, the real one, and said, "Are you certain?" "I am always certain," she said. "You know this about me." He laughed, which was a sound he made more often now, and it was full and good, and Alice sat across from him in her kitchen in their house on their land and thought that some stories do not have the ending you expected when you started them. They have a better one that was not possible until you were ready for it. Their second child was a daughter born in the spring of 1884, small and brown-haired like her father with her mother's determined jaw. They named her Ruth. Clara was 15 by then, past the bird notebook stage, and into the more serious study of natural history that she had declared her life's purpose. And she looked at her sister with a warmth she was working hard not to show and said, with the composed objectivity she had developed as a defense against her own feelings, "She has good lungs." Because Ruth had announced her arrival to the household with considerable force, and everyone agreed this was true. James was 3 years old when Ruth arrived, and he dealt with the situation by immediately appointing himself her protector, which Seth observed with a private satisfaction that he expressed to no one and which was very apparent to Alice, who knew him well enough by now to read his face the way she read a good book, with pleasure and without effort. The town of Caldwell changed through the 1880s as the whole territory changed, the cattle drives shifting, the railroad pushing new routes, the settlers coming in increasing numbers from the east. Some things were good changes. The school expanded. A proper doctor's office opened with Dr. Marsh in it. Some things were harder to watch. The Cheyenne and Comanche peoples, who had known this land for generations before any white settler arrived, were being pushed further and further from it with a systematic cruelty that the newspapers in Caldwell called progress, and which Seth, on the occasions it came up, would look at and say, quietly, and with a gravity that Alice recognized as the voice of a man who had worked alongside enough people from those communities to know what was being lost. That progress was a word people used when they did not want to say what they were actually doing. He said this in a tone that was not a speech and not a performance. He said it because it was true, and because he had made a life with a woman who had told him from the beginning that she valued truth even when it was uncomfortable, and he had believed her, and she had not let him down on it. Margaret Holt retired from the dry goods store in 1886, selling it to a young couple from Indiana, and she came to live in the spare room of the farmhouse at Alice's absolute insistence, which Seth supported without reservation, because Margaret Holt was one of the best people he knew, and because Alice loved her, and that was enough. Margaret sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the evenings and watched the children and watched Seth and Alice moving around each other in the practiced choreography of a couple who knew each other's rhythms, and she told Alice one evening that watching this had been better than any story she had read, and Alice had said, "It's not a story, Margaret. It's just a life," and Margaret had said, "That is what makes it a story." Seth received a letter from Eli in the fall of 1886 saying that Eli's older boy, Henry, was interested in coming west to learn cattle. Was that something Seth could accommodate? And Seth wrote back and said yes, send him in spring. And so in April of 1887, a 17-year-old Henry Graves arrived at the farm full of city confidence and very little practical knowledge, and spent 6 months being thoroughly educated by Seth, who was a patient teacher and a demanding one, and by Clara, who was then 18 and had no patience for nonsense of any kind but a great deal of patience for anyone who was genuinely trying to learn. Henry went back to St. Louis in the fall with a hat he'd earned, calluses he hadn't expected, and a way of looking at the world that had clearly shifted. He also went back with a long and detailed letter from Clara about the botanical and ornithological resources of Missouri that he had been commissioned to research, which told Seth everything he needed to know about what had gone on during those 6 months, and he said nothing about it at all. James grew up strong and quiet like his father, and passionate about horses in a way that seemed predetermined, as though the argument had been won before he was born. By the time he was 8, he could handle most of the horses on the property, and Seth taught him the way he had learned, patient and repetitive, and with a respect for the animal that James absorbed completely. Ruth was something different entirely, energetic and sociable and interested in everything simultaneously, and she brought a noise to the farmhouse that Seth found he did not mind at all, the way he did not mind the wind from the plains or the sound of cattle, because it was the sound of something alive. Clara left for Lawrence in 1889 to study at the University of Kansas. This event was preceded by 6 months of careful negotiation between Clara and Alice, and supported entirely by Seth from the first conversation, who said when Alice brought it to him with a face that was caught between pride and uncertainty, "She has been building toward this since she was 7 years old. You know what you need to do." Alice looked at him. "You are occasionally irritatingly right about things," she said. "I know," he said. They drove Clara to the train in Caldwell on a September morning, the four of them, Seth handling the horses, Alice sitting straight on the seat with that set jaw, James pressing against his mother's side, Ruth waving at everything they passed because Ruth's relationship to the world was fundamentally one of greeting. At the station, Clara hugged her mother for a long time, and then she turned to Seth, and he saw in her face everything that child had been and become. The girl on the wagon seat who had told him he was very large, the girl who had made him sit on a step and wait without knowing why, who had held a carved bird carefully because it mattered, who had grown into a young woman of intelligence and determination and warmth. And Seth put his arms around her, and she said, quietly, into his shoulder, "You were not what I expected," and he said, "Neither were you," and it was the best conversation they'd ever had. The train came and took Clara away, and they stood on the platform until it was gone, and Alice did not cry until they were back in the wagon with the road home in front of them. And Seth put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and he let her take the time she needed, which was the thing he had been best at from the beginning. In 1890, a letter arrived for Seth from a man named Harton in Missouri, a lawyer dealing with the estate of his father, who had died in February. Seth's father had left a small amount, a piece of land in Missouri that was not worth much, and he had, in a final letter to be delivered with the estate, written to Seth directly. Seth read the letter alone the first time. Then he gave it to Alice. It was not a long letter. His father had not been a man of many words, and in the letter the few words worked hard. He wrote that he had not been a good father to Seth. He wrote that the hardness between them had come from a hardness in himself that he had never found the way to unlock, and that he was sorry for it. He wrote that he had heard Seth was settled and had done well, and that this was what he had hoped for, even when he had not been able to say so. He signed it with his name, plain, no address, because a man writing from wherever you write from at the end doesn't need an address. Alice read it and handed it back. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," Seth said. He folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment. "I am glad he wrote it," he said, "even now, especially now." "He gave you what he could," Alice said. "It was not everything you needed, but it was what he had." Seth looked at his wife, who had given him everything she had and had never made it feel like a calculation. He thought about what it was to receive things from people, and what it was to give them, and how the giving, done without condition or expectation, was the root of the thing. "Yes," he said, "I know that." He kept the letter in the cedar chest that had been Alice's mother's, the one she had carried west from Ohio, the one he had moved from the wagon on the first morning. He put it in there with Thomas Kendrick's Bible, and the piece of flannel Alice had wrapped it in, and Clara's first bird notebook, and the first letter from Eli, and other things that were the record of a life that had been built from separate parts into something whole. The autumn of 1890 was fine and gold and long, and on an evening in October, Seth and Alice sat on the porch of their house on their 40 acres in Kansas and watched the sun go down over the plains in the way that prairie sunsets do it, broadly and without subtlety, painting everything orange and rose and a deep burning amber. James was 12 and in the barn with the horses. Ruth was 7 and asleep inside, having fallen asleep at the kitchen table over her primer exactly the way her father had fallen asleep standing up at work on occasion, completely and without warning. Margaret Holt was reading inside by the lamp, the quiet presence she had become in their household, solid and warm. A letter had come from Clara that week, describing a professor of natural history at the university who had, in a recent lecture, discussed the bird populations of the Kansas plains, and had been, in Clara's assessment, mostly right but with several specific errors that she intended to address through the proper channels of academic correspondence. Seth had read this letter to Alice and they had both recognized, in the precise quality of Clara's critique, a particular investment in the subject matter that exceeded the purely academic, and had said nothing about it at all, because some things revealed themselves in their own time and needed no help from parents. Alice was watching the sky and Seth was watching Alice. He had not stopped watching her in all the ways that mattered in 12 years. He still found in the angle of her face and the way she sat and the way she turned to look at things, a person worth looking at, a person whose every expression was worth understanding, a person who made the world make more sense when she was in it. She turned and found him looking at her and smiled the smile that was the real one, the full one, the one he had been seeing since she stood in a dry goods store and said there is enough for three with the composure of a woman who had decided to be brave about something. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The day we met," he said. She considered. "A year from now it will be 13 years. I know it." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they watched the sun finish its work on the horizon. The plains were very still and very large and the sky was every color it knew how to be. "If you had kept walking," she said thoughtfully, the way she thought aloud about things she had been considering for a while. "I know," he said. "What made you stop?" she asked. The real answer. He thought about it honestly, the way he always thought about things she asked him. He thought about that morning, the borrowed wagon, the woman holding a flannel-wrapped Bible against her chest like something precious, the child on the wagon seat who told him he was very large without apology. "Clara told me the truth," he said, "about something true, and I stopped, and then there you were." Alice was quiet for a moment. "She has always known," she said. "Yes," Seth agreed. "And you carried everything," Alice said, "before I had even asked." He looked at her. "There was not another reasonable option," he said, which was what he had said the first day and which was still true, which was the best kind of true, the kind that stays. She put her hand against his jaw, the way she had the first time in the church, and he turned his face into her palm for a moment in the way he had always done, and she felt the roughness of him and the gentleness that lived right alongside it, and she thought, "I will be grateful for this man every day of my life." The sun went down completely and the stars appeared, as they always did over the Kansas plains, in their enormous and indifferent abundance, not caring about the small lights burning in windows below them, the lamp where Margaret read, the lantern in the barn where James talked to the horses, the candle in Ruth's room where she slept with her primer open and her hair loose. Seth and Alice sat in the dark and the starlight and the profound, ordinary warmth of an evening that was exactly like 100 evenings before it and exactly like no other evening at all, because each one was its own and each one mattered. "I love you," Alice said. She said it the way she said true things, directly, without decoration, meaning every word. "I love you," Seth said. He said it the way he had learned to say things that mattered, fully and without protection, because the fence had been down for 12 years and he had not once missed it. They sat together until the night had fully settled and the stars were as bright as they ever got, and then they went inside to the warmth and the light and the life they had built, and the door of the farmhouse closed behind them, and on the plains the wind moved the grass in slow, long waves, and the creek made its small sound, and the world turned on its ordinary, extraordinary axis, and everything was exactly as it should be.